Hi, hvað segið þið? And welcome back to the channel. Y'all know exactly what's up in this video today. We're talking about Icelandic. Let's go! So now we'll start with the history of the language. Icelandic, or Íslenska, is a North Germanic language in the Indo-European language family. As you're probably expecting, Icelandic civilization got started with the Vikings, Germanic people from Scandinavia that you've definitely heard of before. They did a lot of sailing, and some of that led them out west to what we now call Iceland, which they settled in the 870s AD. Iceland had been previously uninhabited outside of probably a few monks from Ireland known as the Papar, but, no women or kids, so they couldn't really establish a society like that. Back to these particular Vikings. At that time, they spoke Old West Norse, a dialect of Old Norse that's really well attested due in part to Iceland's rich literary history. And conveniently, the more specific dialect of Old West Norse we're dealing with here is also known as Old Icelandic. The other one was Old Norwegian, in case you're wondering. This phase lasted until roughly the 1400s, at which point modern Icelandic is considered to have started. That being said, this relatively straightforward history brings up a slight misconception that some people have about Icelandic, that its island geography prevented it from evolving from Old Norse, and it's still basically the same language. This is only partially true. Languages will evolve with or without outside influence, although outside influence does speed up the process a bit. Icelandic, therefore, is not still just Old Norse. Especially in terms of phonology, Icelandic has evolved a considerable amount. The spelling has changed a bit as well. But as for grammar, Icelandic wasn't exposed to the same migration as the continental North Germanic languages Swedish, Danish, and Norwegian, so Icelandic kept the more complicated features from Old Norse that those languages lost. This is also why Faroese and Icelandic look very similar, despite Faroese being more closely related to Norwegian by way of sound change comparison. And as for the common anecdote that modern Icelanders can read the sagas with relative ease, this is heavily debated. Icelandic speakers don't all agree on the veracity of that statement, but it does help that their strong literature has led to a preference for native coinages over loanwords when they come across new technology or ideas. Today, Icelandic is the official language of Iceland, as is expected. It has about 390,000 native speakers with a negligible number of L2 speakers, so the total speaker number stays near 390,000. So now we'll address the fairly complicated subject of Icelandic phonology. To start with the phonemes, the language has 13 vowels and 22 consonants, totaling 35 phonemes. We'll start with the consonants, and it'll be easiest to just take a tour of the allophones here and see what else we can catch. The first one is something that, in theory, is similar to most other Germanic languages, voiceless plosives getting aspirated at the beginnings of words. However, you'll notice on the list of phonemes that the aspirated plosives are listed, and so are the regular voiceless ones. This is because Icelandic had a sound shift where all voiced plosives devoiced, but the voiceless plosives stayed how they were, including the word initial aspiration. This eliminated all voiced plosives from Icelandic and made the aspiration phonemic, even though it only appears as such at the beginning. We'll get to caveats elsewhere later. For example, there's Björn versus peningar, dagur versus trú, and gull versus köttur. But what's up with the middle of köttur? There are also some things that happen to plosives between vowels, and for this, I should mention that Icelandic has consonant gemination, although it doesn't always register as such. For geminated plosives, the formerly voiced ones behave normally, like in krabbi, hreitur, and gluggi. But for the formerly voiceless plosives, their gemination manifests as pre-aspiration, which is exactly what it sounds like, aspiration before the consonant, like in sveppur, nótt, and klukka. But what if a plosive isn't geminated? That's actually irrelevant due to sound changes that happened in the past, so now we can talk about the many allophones that happen to phonemic p, f, and k. The simplest one is p. It becomes f in vowel f consonant position, like in skipti. Phonemic f is even more complicated. It becomes voiced v between vowels, like in ulfur and revur, but only when ungeminated. The geminated f stays voiceless, like in kafach. But even weirder, it undergoes fortition to p between a vowel and a sonorant, like in sapn or kartapla. And similar things happen to phonemic k, the formerly voiced one spelled with a k, which we'll get to later. This sound becomes g between vowels and ungeminated, like with saga or hugur, and the same applies if it's followed by the, like pragdipne. But it stays k if the following sound is a sonorant, like in ukla or rek. It also becomes ch in word final position after a vowel, like lach or teich, becomes y if there's an I around it while it's ungeminated in the middle of a word, like in stiyi, and disappears if it's between two back vowels, like in skowir. But assuming it does remain a plosive, there's another allophone that could happen, and this affects k as well. Velar k becomes palatal k if it's followed by a front vowel other than a, resulting in, for example, kir, fálki, gate, and skuggi. There's also the case of geis, which becomes palatalized because I used to be e. And for similar reasons, ge and k are now considered phonemes. Along with e shifting to I, sometimes there used to be clusters of ge and k, but those have now condensed, resulting in phonemic ge and k, such as in gef and ket. To go along with this, n has two allophones of its own, and the first one is that when it's before a palatal consonant, it'll become palatal nye itself, like in aufinki, and before a velar consonant, it'll become velar ng, like in hunong. diphthong. This would be a phoneme in most other Germanic languages due to the g after it disappearing, but in Icelandic this didn't happen, so it's still an allophone. So I feel like it's time for that look at the rare consonant phonemes, I guess. You've already heard about the palatals, the voiceless palatal plosive g and its aspirated counterpart k. Actually, aspirated plosives being phonemic is somewhat uncommon, so I guess p, t, and k can go here as well. But there's an even rarer feature that Icelandic has. Voiceless sonorants n, hr, and hr are all phonemic, although the more common realization of voiceless l is actually the lateral fricative sh. And for the final two rare phonemes, there's the voiceless palatal fricative sh and the voiceless interdental fricative th, which has a fairly predictable allophone. It becomes voiced intervocalically like in edla and söður. But one of the rare voice assimilation features Icelandic has is that r and l, two sonorants, devoice at the ends of words like in kvalur and mjör. And to finally end the consonants, there's a very confusing allophonic concept, epenthetic or intrusive tje. Yeah. In certain situations, consonant clusters that Icelandic speakers don't like will get broken up by a t sound. One such example is in the name of the language itself, Íslenska, along with snjór. Rn and rl are also bad combos apparently because they're intrusive t's in björn and hákarl. And finally, two of the geminated consonants may also lead to t epenthesis. Double l basically always does, like in völlur and eyjafjallajökull, and this is generally pronounced as a voiceless lateral affricate ch, while double n only gets epenthetic t if there's a diphthong before it or a vowel written with an acute, like in kreit, brut, or feet. Otherwise, it's just So what's this about vowels? Let's find out. To start, both the above things that lead to epenthetic t on geminated the diphthongs and the vowels written with an acute, used to be long vowels, but now any of the vowels in Icelandic can be short or long, and it depends on whether the following consonant is geminated. Geminated consonants are preceded by short vowels, and ungeminated or non-existent consonants have long vowels before them. However, only stressed vowels can be long. It's a tandem that works basically like Italian, and Swedish is similar, except that in Swedish it's actually the vowel that determines the lengths, not the consonant. Most clusters count as geminated for the sake of the vowel, by the way, but not all. To demonstrate this, I'll use two vowels that may confuse some people. There's fiskur and pitch with short vowels, but litur and is with long vowels. The reason I did this is because people familiar with certain other languages may inherently associate I with short vowels and E with long vowels, and historically this was true, but in Icelandic today, I and E can both be either short or long. It just depends on the following consonants, and with this many vowels, some of them are going to be rare. The main ones are u, and öy. But thankfully, that's the end of the complexity to Icelandic vowels. Icelandic does not have vowel reduction, so unstressed syllables still get their full pronunciation, and finally, the stress always falls on the first syllable, but unlike in other Germanic languages, this includes prefixes. They can take the stress from the root. Okay, that was kind of excessive. Let's look at the letters now. Icelandic uses its own version of the Latin alphabet with 32 letters, those being 14 vowels and 18 consonants. In addition, you may also find se, ku, and tfaf in loanwords. Just like we did for the sounds, we'll start with the consonants. The main thing to know about them is that most of the difficulty you'll find in reading them is directly caused by the phonology. The letters actually do a pretty good job representing the phonemes, and once you learn the many thousands of phonological rules, you won't have that many problems sounding out words in Icelandic. For example, F changes pronunciation between f, v, and p, but as long as you remember the allophonic rules, you'll always know how to pronounce that letter. That being said, there's one allophone that gets represented in an interesting way, the one where th becomes the intervocalically. Icelandic actually has two letters for that sound to represent its two allophones, thorn, which is completely unique to Icelandic today, and eth, which only appears in Icelandic, Faroese, and Alfdalian today, although both were used in older forms of English as well. Together, they form an allographic system, like an allophone but with letters. Thorn is used at the beginnings of words like thak and thruma, or roots like svithjóð and athjóðir, while eth is used anywhere else like fithrildi, friður, and pröð. But notice how the eth on that last one is voiceless. This is how the system doesn't perfectly line up with the sounds anymore. It used to be that thorn was th, while eth was th. But then Icelandic started doing word final devoicing, but didn't change the spelling, so nowadays eth is pronounced th at the ends of words. And speaking of voiceless consonants, those voiceless sonorants are interesting. How do they get represented in writing? Well, the phonemic ones have digraphs with how at the beginning. It's pretty easy. There's how et for sh, or sh, how n for hm, and how er for sh. There's also the interesting case of how vaf, which used to indicate hua, but then when w became v, it also dragged the ch into plosivity, so that digraph is now pronounced kv, like in kvitur and kvistra. To finish the digraphs, there's how yoth for sh, like in shirtur, and of course geyoth and kauyoth now say ge and ke respectively, as mentioned earlier. On a related note, gemination is represented by simply doubling the consonant, and because Icelandic has the length tandem, that's also how you can tell the vowel length. So with that, let's move on to vowels. This is a good time to talk about the diacritics because, as I hinted at earlier, Icelandic used to use the acute or brottur to indicate a long vowel, back when vowel length worked independently. However, just because they no longer indicate length doesn't mean they're useless. Each vowel with an acute now has a sound of its own that it developed back when it was phonemically long. Specifically, this is au, this is ye, and this is o. The other three vowels with an acute work in a system with their unmarked counterparts, in which the one with acute represents a tense vowel and the one without acute is a lax vowel. So we have uten u, iten e, and iten e again. Yeah, these two letters used to make different sounds, but then rounded U merged into E, so now they're the same. So as for those other two unusual vowels, they were created by umlauts in the past, and as such, one of them has the umlaut diacritic, or, maybe tadairsis. The other vowel represents the diphthong I. Finally, for the vowels, there are three digraphs to know about. The first two are self-explanatory, as both of these say A, like in sveit or reker. But then there's AU, which makes the diphthong Ö, like in strömur. And then for any letters, Icelandic has capitalization for sentences and names. Now it's time for the sentence structure. Icelandic's default word order is SVO, or subject, verb, object. To give a basic example sentence, we have Rundin keifte miða á kvikmyndinni. This means the puffin bought a ticket to the movie. Word for word, it's subject, verb, object, prepositional phrase, SVO. However, there are two situations where this setup changes and the order becomes VSO instead. First, just like in other Western European languages, questions move the verb to the beginning. So our sentence as a question would be keifte Rundin miða á kvikmyndinni. And also, like a typical Germanic language, Icelandic has V2 restriction where the verb must be the second constituent or indivisible portion of the sentence. So if the sentence starts with an adverb, the verb will move before the subject. So if we want to say the puffin quickly bought a ticket to the movie, it'd be fljótt keifti Lundin miða á kvikmyndinni. So as for other matters of sentence structure, adjectives go before the noun, as do numbers, and supplemental nouns also go before the main noun as compounds, although genitive possessors go after. The language uses prepositions, those that go before the noun phrase, and finally, Icelandic is anti-drop, so you can't just remove a subject pronoun from a sentence. Now let's talk about the nouns. Icelandic nouns are inflected for two numbers, singular and plural, and divided into three genders, masculine, feminine, and neuter. In theory, the gender of a noun can be determined by looking at it, but there are a lot of exceptions, especially with certain suffixes. The basic patterns the resources told me to look for when I studied Icelandic were: masculine ends with ur, like huntur and bátur, feminine ends with a, like eja and fidla, and neuter doesn't have a special suffix like haf and ski. However, there are three more suffixes that could indicate the masculine gender: and n, so rinte, jökull, and himin are all masculine. There are also two more feminine suffixes, ink, like in eltink, and un, like in verslun. Unfortunately, most of the above rules get broken fairly frequently. To start, a lot of the suffixes that are masculine in theory can be on words of other genders, like how eple is neuter, fjall is also neuter, tun is feminine, and silfur is neuter. Although there's a trick for that last one. If you know its Germanic cognates, then you can tell it's neuter because the ur is part of the root, not a suffix. But don't think the feminine and neuter suffixes are missing out on the fun. They switch nouns a lot too. First, there's the standard fact that the body parts auga and eira are both neuter instead of feminine, but also there are a lot of nouns with no particular suffix that aren't neuter, like how borg, sol, strand, mjölk, and brú are all feminine, while örn, fugl, and opn are masculine. This whole section about gender identification perfectly exemplifies what is, in my opinion, the hardest part of Icelandic: subclasses. Because apparently 3 grammatical genders just wasn't enough. Each gender has multiple agreement systems within it. So now, this is normally where I talk about pluralization, but for Icelandic, it makes way more sense to just jump straight into the cases and discuss both singular and plural cases together, so that's what we're doing. Icelandic has 4 cases: nominative, accusative, dative, and genitive. The nominative case is the subject of the sentence, and as normal, it's also the case that's shown by default. The accusative case indicates the direct object and is also governed by these prepositions, meaning that the accusative goes after them. Then, the dative case is used for the indirect object, and these prepositions govern it, but notice how there's a fair amount of overlap between those two cases. This because Icelandic does the typical Indo-European thing where, for prepositions that could indicate either a location or a destination, the dative is used for the location since it absorbed all the cases that would have been used for that, while the accusative means that it's a destination. For example, I'm on the moon in Icelandic is ég er á tunglinu with the dative case, whereas I landed on the moon is ég lenti á tunglið with the accusative case. And finally, the genitive case shows the possessor and comes with its own entourage of governing prepositions. So now to show how these cases look, we're just gonna have to raw dog some example nouns. I'll start with the masculine since it's especially guilty of having subclasses, with the urt nouns potentially fitting into a few different patterns. I made my own code to understand them. Speaking of dogs, here's hunter, since it fits into what I call masculine category 1. In this paradigm, the genitive singular ends with s, while the nominative plural ends with ar. As for the rest of the cases, you'll notice that the accusative singular just drops the ur suffix, the dative singular ends with I, the accusative and genitive plurals both end with a, and the dative plural, which is generally seen as the most reliable case declension, ends with But before moving on to another paradigm, I need to show another class 1 masculine noun, tahur, because what are those vowels? Yeah, Icelandic has two types of umlaut that it still uses in a lot of words. The dative singular uses I umlauts, where the I in the suffix makes the root vowel e, so that word is teie. And the dative plural uses U umlauts, which makes the root vowel so that form is törum. Now on to category 2, here's söður. For it, the genitive singular ends with ar, while the nominative plural ends with ir. And to match that ir, the accusative plural changed the a to I, but note that the genitive plural didn't change, it still ends with a. Also, the dative singular lost its I, now it's suffixless, sometimes. And for a category 2 masculine noun that has umlaut, here's köttur. First, the dative singular is suffixes back. This is super complicated, and if you really want to learn how it works, just go to the Icelandic grammar reference page linked in the description. But also, notice how it's only the genitive forms that aren't affected by any umlaut. Even the nominative singular has umlaut, and comparing this with the umlaut in tahur actually hints at the origin of Icelandic having two different types of masculine nouns. It has to do with noun suffixes in Proto-Germanic. If a noun ended with uz, then the modern Icelandic noun is class 1, as happened with dagas and hundas. But if it ended with uz, or maybe is, then it became class 2 in Icelandic and got a lot more umlaut, which happened to kattus. Unfortunately, sometimes these classes can be combined into a situation where the singular behaves one way but the plural behaves another. The most common is what I call 1-2, like revur. It's class 1 in singular but class 2 in plural. But there are also 2-1 nouns like skowir, which do the opposite, and this is especially confusing because the genitive singular and nominative plural are both skowar. And this is all not to mention class 3 like lúður, which keeps the r and just deletes the u in several cases. In case you're wondering, this is called syncope. I also need to mention maður here because its other forms look completely different. Here they are. So now for the other masculine suffixes. Here's jökull, and you'll see that it mostly resembles category 1. The interesting thing is that the accusative simply drops the second et, becoming jökull without the t. You also have to remember any length changes that happen, like how in the nominative, beach has a short vowel, but in the accusative, beach has a long one since the consonant became short. And here's himin, which also looks like category 1. And now I'll show dinte, because the masculine nouns ending with I are part of the best behaved pattern among Icelandic nouns. Every singular case other than the nominative ends with a, while the plurals follow the basic class 1 model. So now we'll move to the feminine nouns, and here's eya. For this one, every other singular case ends with u, so it's seen as the feminine version of I. As for the plural, the nominative and accusative both end with ur, while the dative and genitive plural are the same as everywhere. And to represent feminine nouns with no suffix, here's pork. It doesn't change at all in the singular, except for the genitive, which is porkar, and in the plural, the nominative and accusative are both porkir, so these nouns are a bit like masculine category 2. And then there are the neuter nouns like ski. Neuter nouns, compared to everything we've seen, are pretty light. Most of their charts just look like this, including the fact that the nominative and accusative plural don't add a suffix. However, note that there's u umlaut in the plural, which will affect nouns with a in the root, such as half. Its nominative and accusative plural is höf, so they're not always the same as the singular. This same simplicity applies to the irregular neuter nouns that end with I, like eple. But then for those body parts that end with a, they have their own pattern where all singular forms are identical and the plural forms have an u in the suffix. So now we're at the articles. To start, outside of demonstratives, Icelandic has no indefinite articles, only definite ones, and they appear as suffixes on nouns of the appropriate case. Wiktionary actually shows the definite nouns as extra columns alongside singular and plural, and that works, but I won't do that because I want to isolate the articles. Thankfully here, there are no subclasses. The articles are predictable as long as you know the gender, number, and case. Here's the big chart of the articles for reference, but we'll look at individual examples for each as needed, starting with the masculine. The nominative and accusative masculine singular article is a double N, but there'll be an I before that if the noun ends with a consonant. And remember, despite the article being the same for both of them, the words are still different because the ur suffix is only on the nominative. Then, the dative singular is num, and the genitive singular is ins. Yes, the S is on the article, regardless whether the masculine noun itself has it. Then for the masculine plural, the articles are in case order, nir, na, num, and na, with a geminated n. The dative and genitive plural articles don't change for gender, so that's good. I should also mention that the dative plural article actually does slightly change the word, the M is removed from the indefinite form before the suffix is added. But also, notice how the nominative plural article for masculine nouns is nir. This is a subtle difference from the feminine counterpart nar. Now looking at the feminine articles, nar is both nominative and accusative plural. As for the singular, unlike in the masculine, the feminine nominative article is just a single N. The other three singular articles are also unique, being na, ne with gemination, and nar, also with gemination. So now we'll see the neuter articles, which are pretty interesting. The genitive singular matches the masculine, ins, and the dative and genitive plural articles are the same as always. But beyond that, they're all unique to the neuter. For one, the dative singular neuter article is nu, not num like the masculine version. Kinda tricky. And something even trickier is that the article for nominative and accusative plural is in, which is singular for feminine nouns. But then for the neuter singular, the nominative and accusative article is if. This is good because even when a neuter noun has identical singular and plural forms, the articles will differentiate them if they're there. So finally, Icelandic has 3 degrees of demonstrative articles, which are words before the noun, and they all inflect for everything. Proximal is theta, medial is that, and distal is hit. Alright, it's pronoun time. Here's the big chart of them, and we'll see what we notice. First off, logically, the same 4 cases that nouns use apply here as well. Also, the pronouns for third person differentiate all 3 genders in both singular and plural, while the first and second person pronouns do none of that gender agreement stuff. And other than the larger than average amount of pronouns, there's not much to discuss about this chart. They behave pretty well. The third person plural even helps us out a bit by not doing gender agreement in the dative and genitive. In addition to all of these, there's a set of third person reflexive pronouns only used in object position, sich, sér, and sín. So now briefly back to the big chart, I'll point out the first and second person genitive singular forms. These are the forms you'd use with a preposition that governs the genitive case, like söke mín, due to me, or án þín, without you. However, for these 2 in particular, along with the reflexive pronouns, they have an entirely separate, fully inflected set of possessive pronouns which mostly resemble the definite articles. For the other grammatical persons, you'd actually just use the genitive forms from the big chart. But either way, there are a couple syntactic things to say about this arrangement. If a noun has any possessive pronoun with it, the noun will have the definite article, and the possessive pronoun goes after the noun. So for example, my house is húsið mitt, while their art is listin þeirra. Now we're at the numbers, so here's 1 through 10. Although for 1 through 4, these are actually just the masculine nominative forms because those numbers have full inflection tables for gender and case. 1, 8, even has both singular and plural. Numbers 5 and above don't inflect for anything though, and numbers don't affect the pluralization of their nouns. So as for larger numbers, the 10s are made by simply adding tu to the end of some form of the digit, except 20, tuktugu, which is weirder. And to make a 2-digit number, just say the 10's number, then o, meaning and the 1's number. Unless of course it's a number from 11 to 19, those look like this, adding the suffix town starting at 13. And finally, here are the ordinal numbers 1st through 10th. Of course, 1st and 2nd do their own thing, being fyrstur and annar, but the rest of them add some suffix like the or te, and then they get inflected like adjectives. Some of the time. So to learn what I meant with that ominous comment, let's talk about adjectives. Here's the inflection chart of kvítur as an example, and as you'll see, Icelandic adjectives are inflected for gender, number, and case. Unfortunately, the suffixes on the adjectives most commonly do not match the corresponding nouns, specifically these. In particular, in the nominative singular, feminine adjectives don't have a suffix, while neuter ones take a t at the end, which they also do in the accusative. Speaking of which, masculine and feminine accusative singular adjectives both change from the nouns being an and a respectively. Then in the dative, they all changed, and in the genitive, they mostly share the suffixes with the corresponding nouns, except for that extra er in the feminine, which we'll come back to. On the plural half of this chart, thankfully, there's only 1 dative and 1 genitive form, and they both match the nouns. But for the nominative case, the masculine and feminine almost swap suffixes for the adjectives, except that masculine plural adjectives end with ir instead of ur, while the neuter does match the nouns with its lack of suffix. The masculine is the only gender where adjectives make a distinction between nominative and accusative. So now let's look at those boxes with an er seemingly inserted between the root and the suffix. They affect the dative and genitive feminine singular and the unified genitive plural, but it's at this point that I need to acknowledge the existence of adjectives whose masculine singular nominative forms don't end with ur. Some of them, just like masculine nouns, could also end with double h or double n. Here's grætin as an example. I am having a colorful section. For most of the forms, the second n drops off before the suffix is added, including the zero morpheme. But for the places where we've seen kvítre, kvítrar, and kvítra, that middle er basically assimilates to the n, geminating it and becoming grænne, grænnar, and grænna. And the same thing happens with double h adjectives like intæch, meaning nice. That would-be er assimilates to the h and regeminates it. And now for some more difficulty. The adjective forms on these charts have been showing are used for all adjectives in predicative position after the verb be and in attributive position before a noun. only when the noun is indefinite. That's right, if the noun has a definite article on it, you use an adjective from a completely different chart. The good news is that the definite adjectives are short and very easy to remember. For masculine and feminine singular, the suffix is one vowel for the nominative case and a different vowel for all the other cases. For masculine, it's I and a, and for feminine, it's a and u. Meanwhile, for neuter singular, the suffix is always a, and for plural definite adjectives, it's u across the board regardless of gender or case. That a form, by the way, is also how you form an adverb from an adjective, unless you use te. So now to finish the adjectives, Icelandic has both comparative and superlative degrees that adjectives can be inflected for. The comparative, meaning more, has the suffix ade, which has its own inflections, although for adjectives like deit and inteit, the absorption thing happens. And for the superlative, meaning most, the suffix is astur, and this one is fully inflectable across both definitenesses. There's some suppleted adjectives on this front, but it's all the usual suspects, and we've said enough about Icelandic adjectives. So let's get into the verbs. The first thing to know is that Icelandic has infinitive verbs and they end with a. However, Icelandic also has verb classes, and those obviously can't be determined just by looking at the infinitive verb. The classes are based on the third person singular indicative present tense conjugation, which could come with a few suffixes ar, ur, or nothing, along with some weirder instances. So knowing that, let's get right into the conjugation. Our primary example verbs will be tala for the ar verbs, heira for the ir verbs, skilja for the ur verbs, and spyrja for the zero class. And since they exemplify the verb classes, of course we're starting with the indicative present tense, so here's tala. The chart layout is completely ordinary. There are 3 people and 2 numbers, just like most other European languages. As I mentioned for the verb classes, the third person singular has the indicated suffix on it, but also notice how the first person singular is tala with an a suffix. This is another feature that'll change with class. And of course I gotta mention the first person plural because it's affected by u umlauts being tölum. So now let's look at heira, the ir verb. Of course the second and third person singular both end with ir, but the first person also switched to I. And then for skilja, the third person singular suffix is ur, but surprisingly the first person form actually just drops any suffix for this one. By the way, in case you're wondering, the infinitive suffix being ja instead of just a is something that may happen, particularly for ir and ur verbs. It only sometimes affects the plural forms. But something else to be aware of with the ur verbs is that verbs with a in the root will change it to e in the singular forms like stanta, which becomes stentur. So then there's the zero class verb spyrja. Thankfully, all the plural suffixes are still there, but the singular ones are a bit peculiar. The first and third person match, both having no suffix, but the second person adds its own new suffix. So those are the regular verbs, but unfortunately, there's a fair amount of irregulars in the present tense. For the usual suspect, here's vera, meaning be, which becomes in derivatives in the present. As for some other common irregulars, many of them do similar vowel morphing to the previous stanta stentur example, like hlaupa to schleiper and flua to fliegur, along with fara to fer in the zero class. Some others are muna to man, sjau to sjer, and a really weird one, veta to veit. So now, if you're expecting to hear about the past tense, sorry to disappoint, but you're gonna have to wait. That's because Icelandic has a subjunctive mood, and the subjunctive present is not that different from the indicative present. If you're not familiar, the subjunctive mood is an alternative verb conjugation that affects specifically verbs in subordinate clauses after the conjunction that when there's a level of non-reality to that verb, like if you're just hoping it happens. It indicates doubt. So here's tala in the subjunctive present, and you'll see most of its forms end with some sort of I suffix, which is the subjunctive's trademark. Also notably, only the second person singular ends with er. The third person singular doesn't do that here. But the first and second person plural are identical to the indicative at least. So here's heira, and since it's already an ir verb, most of the forms are the same as the indicative. The only differences are on the third person, where the singular lacks the final er and the plural uses I instead of a, as is true with all verb classes. So then for skilja, the subjunctive actually keeps the yoth in all forms and the same suffix is added in each slot as we've seen before. Spyrja does something similar. There are some irregular verbs in the subjunctive like vera to sie, but this conjugational category is pretty good overall. The same, however, cannot be said of the past tense. Here's tala in the indicative past, which is a regular verb. Therefore, it goes into the past with the suffix ade plus anything personal that gets added. So here's heira, which is similar, but since it's an ir verb, it cuts out the vowel before the. Otherwise, there's no difference. Skilja also behaves like that, but the suffix is de instead. In theory, I could defend this point with more example verbs, but since this is a Germanic language, y'all know exactly what's coming. Icelandic has an overabundance of irregular past tense verbs, which change their internal vowel in the opt-out system. The ir, ur, and zero class verbs are far more likely to do opt-out than the ar verbs, which actually applies to spyrja as well. I couldn't do better than it for example verbs because there is not even a single zero class verb on my vocab list that's regular in the past. The thing is, spyrja still has the suffix on there. A lot of other opt-out verbs just use the vowel change like all of these. And I'll show the full chart for vera for one purpose. The second person singular in any of these pure opt-out verbs has the suffix st, like how you were is varst. And since there's an indicative past, there's also naturally a subjunctive past. Here's tala, and it's exactly the same as the indicative past. Same applies to heira and skilja. But then for spirja, interestingly, it was irregular in the indicative past, but it's regular in the subjunctive past, being spirde. And that's the interesting part of the subjunctive past. Normally, the irregular verbs from the indicative past are even more irregular here, because in addition to the opt-out they already do, they also do umlaut. This pattern can be seen on the copula vera, for example, which is var in the indicative past, but vaire in the subjunctive past. This can also be observed on these other example verbs. And it's now that I'll bring up specifically the verb hava, meaning have. It's an verb, so it does umlauts in the indicative present, and then it's surprisingly normal in the subjunctive present and the indicative past. The subjunctive past undergoes umlauts once again, but in relation to the indicative past becoming hevde. So why do we suddenly care so much about this verb? Because Icelandic has the have perfect. Yep, just like a lot of languages back on the continent, Icelandic uses a construction of the verb hava, conjugated appropriately, followed by the neuter singular nominative passive participle to indicate that something has happened by another time, the time indicated on the auxiliary verb hava. So then how do you make the passive participle? It depends. For regular adverbs like tala, you just take the past tense form and cut off the vowel at the end, resulting in talath. For verbs, it's similar, but since the th would go right next to another consonant, it changes to t, so from heira we get heirt. But with skilja, it actually doesn't work like that. That passive participle is skilith, and now I should mention that these are adjectives that have full inflection tables. The reason this one looks weird is that its masculine singular nominative form is skilin, while the previous two example verbs ends with in that form. As for the irregular verbs, they often follow the in pattern, sometimes with a vowel change, other times not. So now for the final true conjugation category, there's the imperative. It only has two forms, second person singular and plural, so here's all the example verbs. The plural is pretty consistent, it always adds the ith suffix, while for the singular, the adverbs keep that a suffix, while the other classes just have the root there. So now we get into the endgame of verbs. To start, any verb conjugation can take an extra st suffix, and this will make it media passive, so either intransitive or passive. It's affected by the verb rather than actually doing it. For example, we've seen that heira means hear, but with the suffix heirast means be heard. And here's its indicative present table, just to show that and eth get replaced when this happens. So now, if you're somehow disappointed by Icelandic's apparent lack of tenses and aspects, I have good news. There are more of them, shown through auxiliary verbs. They're made from the weird verb munu, which in its indicative present conjugations is the auxiliary verb for the future tense, what will happen, and in its subjunctive past conjugations indicates the conditional mood, what would happen. Next, we talked about the passive participle, and this implies the existence of an active participle, a deverbal adjective indicating the doer of a verb. You make it by adding the suffix ante to the infinitive verb, which in English would be called the ing form. So, does this mean that it's also used in an Icelandic progressive construction? Interestingly, no, but Icelandic does have it. The progressive is used to indicate an ongoing action. You make it with the appropriately conjugated form of vera, meaning be, followed by the preposition ath, meaning at, and then the infinitive verb. Here are some examples. And to finish the verbs, negation isn't too hard. It's the particle ekki, which goes after the verb in all situations except the imperative, in which case it goes before the verb. So now for the extra stuff section, there are three things to talk about. First, since we were just talking about the verbs, it may interest you to know that in any situation where the verb goes before the subject, if the subject is the pronoun thu, it can compound onto the verb before it, but the thorten will change to f. So like, do you speak Icelandic is tara du Íslensku? Second, Icelandic has a distinction on the conjunction that. Ath is used when connecting a whole clause to a subordinate clause, whereas use sem if just a noun is being connected. So like, I hear that you found a job is ég heyra að þú finnur verk, but the train that was built has big wheels is lestin sempik thist hefur stór hjól. And finally, one feature found in Icelandic that the linguists would be very mad if I didn't mention is that a few verbs are what's known as quirky subject verbs. This means that they govern two objects but no subject. This is best exemplified with the verb for like, líka. A sentence with it, which I took directly from the verb glossary where I explained this for the first time, is Birninum líkar við mátt. The bear likes power. The bear, doing the liking, is in the dative case, while the power, which is liked, is in a prepositional phrase with the accusative case. Nothing is nominative. So finally, way later than usual, let's see the example sentences. The first one is, Ég sá þungu hindberin með rjóma í kassanum. This means, I saw the heavy raspberries with cream in the box. So first there's ég, the first person singular subject pronoun. Then there's sá, the corresponding indicative past tense form of sjá, meaning see, and yes, it's irregular. Then we have an adjective noun phrase, þungu hindberin. Looking first at the noun hindber is the neuter noun meaning raspberry, and it's in the accusative case, but it has the definite article in. If it was feminine, in that article there would be singular. But the noun is neuter, so this is instead the plural definite article, or the raspberries. So as for the adjective, it also has to be definite, which means its formation is super easy. All definite definite plural adjectives take the suffix u, so we get thunku from thunkur, meaning heavy. Next, there's a prepositional phrase, me rjoma. Meth means with, and it governs the dative case, so that's what we find rjoma. Rjome is the masculine noun meaning cream. And then we finish with a similar prepositional phrase, ikasanim. In this case, though, e could govern either the dative or accusative case, depending on whether it means in or into. So then we see the noun kasanim. That's the masculine noun kasse, meaning box, in the dative case with the dative definite article on it. So now we know, this phrase is locational in the box with the dative, not into the box with the accusative. The other example sentence is Seta munu entert nar vona ad venert ner siner færi ljufenkanost. This means, later, the ducks will hope that their friends bring delicious cheese. First, seta is the adverb meaning later, and of course that means the verb comes next. But actually, not the whole verb. If the verb moves before the subject, but it uses an auxiliary verb, then only the auxiliary will move. The action verb stays where it is. Therefore, before the subject, there's munu, the third person plural conjugation of munu, that weird future auxiliary that doesn't end with a, and after the subject, there's vona, the infinitive verb meaning hope. So what about the subject itself? That's enternar. Enter is the nominative plural form of unt, the feminine noun meaning duck, both those forms are umlauted, with nar, the definite article to go with it. After that, there's ath, the conjunction that, and then another nominative noun phrase, venir ner sinir. Venir is the nominative plural of venur, the category 2 masculine noun meaning friend, and since it's masculine, this time the definite article is nir. Then there's sinir, the corresponding reflexive possessive pronoun since it refers back to the ducks. Then there's feide. This is the third person plural subjunctive present conjugation of feida, meaning bring. It's in a subordinate clause, and here it expresses a desire. It's got the characteristic e suffix. So finally, we have an indefinite noun phrase, ljufenkanost. Ost is the accusative singular form of ostir, meaning cheese. The accusative form drops the suffix. But the corresponding adjective does have the suffix an, and this is difficult to remember as this adjective is indefinite. After all that, næstum trapp hljóðkerfisfræði kaplinn mig og restin af myndbandinu hjálpaði ekki líka. Íslenska germanskt tungumál með flækju Stínus klavnesks. Málfræðin mjög gömul, en framburðurinn mjög nýr og málvísindalega það morðingasamsetning. Þar eru óterreifanlegir hlutar allstaðar sem maður lítur og aldrei fær maður hlé. Góðu fréttirnar að framburðurinn í íslensku hljómar nákvæmlega eins og hvernig ég myndi búast við að tungumál frá því langt norðri hljómi, með órituðum hljómbyrðum og hliðmætum önghljóðum sem hljóma eins og vindur og snjór. Það mjög flott tungumál og það passar við eigana sína fullkomlega. Ég vona þið nytið að læra allt íslensku. Ef svo líkið og áskrifið. Takk fyrir að horfa.